The ground itself seemed to shake that afternoon in the Bavarian countryside, a trembling that started somewhere deep beneath the earth and rose up through the wooden planks of the barracks floor. Greta Weber felt it in her bones first, that distinctive rumbling that could only mean one thing: heavy machinery moving closer, tanks and armoured vehicles crushing everything in their path as they rolled through what remained of a war that everyone knew was dying its final death. She moved without thinking, her body responding to instincts that had kept her alive through 4 brutal years, sliding along the rough wooden wall until she stood directly between the sound of approaching engines and the 2 women who had become something like family in this place that was nothing like home. 23 years old, and she had learned that survival sometimes meant making yourself the most obvious target, the one they would reach first, giving the others a few extra seconds to prepare themselves for whatever came next. Behind her, Liesl was doing that thing with her hands again, twisting the fabric of her threadbare dress between her fingers until the grey material bunched and wrinkled, a nervous gesture that had become so automatic over the past 3 years that the dress now had permanent creases where she gripped it. The girl was 19, just a teenager really, though her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that belonged to someone 3 times her age. Her voice came out small and frightened when she whispered that they must be American tanks, the words barely audible over the mechanical thunder that was growing louder with each passing second. Ingrid Schneider maintained her rigid posture on the edge of her narrow cot, spine straight as a ruler, shoulders back, every inch of her 28-year-old frame holding on to the dignity of the schoolteacher she had been before the world collapsed around her. She had a way of speaking that was almost clinical, like she was giving a lecture to her former students about some historical event that had happened long ago, even when she was talking about the immediate present. The Wehrmacht soldiers had fled before sunrise, she observed in that precise way of hers, her knuckles bone-white where they gripped the edge of her thin blanket. They had abandoned everything in their retreat, all their equipment and supplies and structures, and most significantly, they had abandoned the women they had kept imprisoned here for years. The 3 of them fell silent then, their breathing shallow and carefully controlled, each woman listening to the approaching vehicles with the heightened awareness of prey animals who had learned to detect predators from the smallest sounds. Through the single window in their barracks, grimy with years of accumulated dust and deliberately left unwashed because clean windows meant people could see in more clearly, Greta watched the dust clouds rising in the distance. The late afternoon sun caught the particles and made them glow like some kind of apocalyptic fog, backlit and otherworldly. She had been staring through this same window since she was 19 years old, since soldiers in German uniforms had come to her village and told her parents that their daughter was needed for essential war work, that it was her patriotic duty to serve the Reich in whatever capacity she was assigned. The lie had been delivered with such bureaucratic efficiency, stamped with official seals and signed by important officers, that her mother had actually helped her pack a small travelling bag. She could still remember her mother carefully folding her best dress, the blue one with the white collar that her grandmother had sewn for her 16th birthday, and placing it in the bag alongside her grandmother's old prayer book, the leather binding soft and worn from decades of use. That prayer book had disappeared during the terrible winter of 1943, traded to a guard for half a loaf of bread when hunger had become more pressing than faith. But Greta still knew every prayer by heart, could recite them perfectly in her mind, even though she had stopped believing that anyone was listening to prayers uttered by women like her. The words were still there, locked somewhere in her memory alongside everything else from the life she had lived before, when she was just a village girl who helped her mother in the garden and dreamed about maybe falling in love someday with a kind man who would treat her gently. The mechanical roar became deafening, filling the barracks with sound so overwhelming that Greta could feel it vibrating in her chest cavity, and then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed felt almost worse than the noise, heavy with anticipation and dread. Male voices began shouting orders in English, harsh consonants and unfamiliar words that she could not understand but recognized immediately as the language of men taking control of territory that did not belong to them. She had heard German officers use that same tone of absolute authority when they arrived at new postings, that particular combination of command and expectation of obedience that transcended individual languages and became universal. "Stay close behind me," Greta whispered to the others, even though she was fully aware of how pointless the instruction was. There were no escape routes from this building, no back doors or hidden passages or convenient ways to disappear. They had learned during their first weeks here not to waste time looking for exits that did not exist. The barracks had been deliberately designed with only one door, one window, one way in and one way out, making the women inside easy to control and monitor. Heavy military boots crunched across the gravel courtyard outside, multiple sets of them moving in synchronized formation, the distinctive rhythm of soldiers who had been trained to move as a unit. Greta felt her body automatically arranging itself into the posture that had become second nature over 4 long years, a carefully calibrated stance that communicated availability without enthusiasm, compliance without complete submission. Her shoulders went back just enough to make herself visible, her eyes lowered just enough to appear appropriately deferential, her hands clasped loosely at her sides in a position that suggested she was waiting for instructions. It was a delicate balance that had taken her months to master, learning through painful trial and error exactly how to hold herself so that the men would find her acceptably cooperative without being provocative enough to trigger their cruelty or their lust for domination. Liesel made a sound that was half whimper and half sob, pressing herself against the far wall as if she could somehow merge with the wooden planks and disappear. She had been only 16 when they brought her here from the Hamburg orphanage, telling her she was being sent to work in a munitions factory, that the fatherland needed strong young women to support the war effort. She had never quite learned how to hide her terror the way the older women eventually did, could not seem to master the blank expression and controlled breathing that made survival slightly more bearable. Her fear was too honest, too visible on her young face, and Greta had spent years trying to shield her from the worst of the men's attention, though she had not always succeeded. "Just keep breathing," Ingrid murmured in her teacher voice, that calm instructional tone she must have used in her classroom when a student was struggling with a difficult concept. Slow, steady breaths. Focus on the breathing. The boots stopped directly outside their door, and Greta heard a man speaking English in what sounded like a question, followed by another male voice responding with what she assumed was an answer. She caught the word secure and understood enough context to realize they were discussing the building itself, cataloguing its contents the way soldiers always did when they took control of new territory. After 4 years of being counted and inventoried like equipment, she had become fluent in the language of being treated as property rather than as people. The door handle began to turn with that distinctive metallic squeak that came from hinges that had not been oiled in years. Greta straightened her spine another fraction of an inch and lifted her chin very slightly, making herself clearly visible to whoever was about to enter. Experience had taught her that it was far better to be immediately noticed than to be discovered hiding in a corner or behind furniture, because men who found you trying to conceal yourself assumed you had done something wrong, had some guilt or shame that deserved punishment. Better to present yourself directly and hope they would be satisfied with simple compliance. Afternoon sunlight poured into the dim interior of the barracks as the door swung fully open, temporarily blinding them after the perpetual gloom they had grown accustomed to. The figure in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the brightness, dressed in an American military uniform that looked surprisingly clean and well-maintained. Behind him, visible through the open door, stood several more soldiers, younger men with faces that had been recently shaved and uniforms that still had proper creases pressed into them. They smelled different from German soldiers, Greta noticed immediately. Instead of the familiar combination of old sweat and cheap cigarettes and unwashed wool that she had learned to associate with men in uniform, these Americans carried the scent of soap and starch and something that might have been laundry detergent. The officer standing in the doorway paused there without stepping inside, his eyes moving slowly from Greta to Liesel to Ingrid, taking in the scene before him with what appeared to be genuine observation rather than the predatory assessment she had learned to expect. Something flickered across his features that Greta had not seen in a man's face for 4 years, an expression that looked almost like shock, followed quickly by recognition, and then something else entirely that might have been pity or compassion if she had dared to hope for such impossible things. He turned his head and spoke quietly to the soldiers standing behind him in the doorway, his voice low and controlled, issuing instructions in English that she could not understand. Then he took a deliberate step backward, moving away from their threshold rather than crossing it, maintaining the distance between himself and them as if he understood that space itself could be a form of respect. When he spoke again, it was in German, heavily accented but clear enough to understand, the words coming slowly as if he was being careful to get them right. "We are not going to hurt you," he said, his tone suggesting he meant it as a promise rather than a threat. "You are safe now. Nobody here is going to harm you." The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible to grasp, a concept so foreign to their experience that Greta could not quite process what it might mean. 4 years had taught her not to trust promises from men in uniforms, regardless of what language they spoke or what flag they served. But this man had not even crossed their threshold, had not made any move to touch them or claim the space they occupied, and that small detail felt significant in a way she could not quite articulate. The truck bed where they sat was lined with clean canvas that did not carry the usual stench of diesel fuel or unwashed bodies, or the vomit of women who had been transported in similar vehicles before. Greta sat wedged between Liesel and Ingrid, their shoulders pressed together in the tight formation they had maintained through countless previous transports over the years, a human chain that provided minimal comfort and maximum solidarity. But this transport was different in ways that kept surprising her with small details that did not match her expectations. Nobody had separated them when loading the truck. No officer had pointed at Liesel and dragged her toward a different vehicle. No guard had shoved Ingrid toward the front cabin where officers traditionally rode. They were together, all 3 of them in the same space, and that simple fact felt like such an unexpected mercy that Greta almost could not process the implications. The American soldier who was driving the truck had helped them climb into the back without touching them any more than absolutely necessary for safety. He had simply extended his open palm upward, waiting patiently for each woman to decide whether she wanted to accept his offered assistance or manage on her own. When Liesel had instinctively flinched away from his outstretched hand, recoiling from the approach of male fingers even when they were clearly meant to help rather than hurt, he had quietly placed a wooden crate beside the tailgate without comment or complaint, creating a makeshift step that allowed her to climb up by herself without needing to touch him at all. Through the opening in the canvas covering, Greta watched the Bavarian countryside rolling past outside. Familiar fields scarred by the deep tracks of tank treads and scattered with abandoned military equipment slowly rusting in the spring weather, but still managing to produce new green growth despite the violence that had been inflicted on the land. The war was ending. Everyone said so with the kind of certainty that came from seeing the evidence everywhere. She had heard it whispered among the guards during their final nervous days at the brothel, had seen it in the way Wehrmacht officers had frantically destroyed documents and fled in the hours before dawn without bothering to give final instructions or make arrangements for the women they were abandoning. But endings had never meant freedom for women like them, had never translated into safety or dignity or the right to make choices about their own lives. In Greta's experience, endings just meant beginnings under different masters, new uniforms and different languages, but the same fundamental powerlessness. The camp they called Lucky Strike sprawled across a hillside like a temporary city built from canvas and wood, row after row of identical tents and rectangular buildings arranged in the neat military lines that suggested order and control. It was surrounded by wire fencing that looked disturbingly familiar to Greta, the kind of barrier designed to keep people contained rather than to keep danger out. Her stomach tightened involuntarily as their truck approached the main gate, an automatic physical response to the sight of guards and barriers and controlled entry points. The guards standing at the gate wore different uniforms and carried different weapons than she was accustomed to, but gates were gates and fences were fences, and her body remembered what those things meant, regardless of what flag was flying overhead. The trucks came to a stop in front of a low wooden building marked with a red cross symbol that Greta vaguely recognized as indicating medical facilities. The same soldier who had driven them with such careful attention to their comfort opened the tailgate and stepped back immediately, giving them adequate space to climb down at their own pace without feeling rushed or crowded. Greta found herself noticing the small details of how he moved, how he kept his hands visible at all times, how he announced each action before performing it so they would not be startled by sudden movements. These were not the behaviours of men who took what they wanted without asking permission or considering consequences. A tall sergeant emerged from the medical building, his uniform still crisp and properly creased despite the late afternoon heat that was making Greta's dress stick to her back with perspiration. His face was weathered in a way that suggested he had spent significant time outdoors, lined with wrinkles that spoke of age and experience, but his eyes were kind. The crow's feet around them suggested he smiled frequently, though at the moment his expression was serious and focused. He spoke briefly to their driver in English, then approached the three women with slow, measured steps that telegraphed his intentions well in advance. "My name is Sergeant Morrison," he said in German that was heavily accented but perfectly comprehensible, each word pronounced with obvious care. "You will be staying in Building 7 during your time here at this facility. The building has been cleaned and prepared for your arrival. It is secure and private. No one will enter your quarters without your explicit permission. Nobody will disturb you without being invited inside." Liesel made a small sound of disbelief that she tried unsuccessfully to muffle with her hand. Permission. The concept felt almost meaningless after 4 years of having no authority over who entered their space or what was done to their bodies once men were inside. They had not been asked for permission regarding anything that mattered in so long that Greta had nearly forgotten what it felt like to have choices that carried actual weight, to have her agreement or disagreement treated as relevant to what happened next. Morrison led them across the compound at a pace that accommodated their exhaustion and uncertainty, past rows of canvas tents where American soldiers looked up from their evening activities to watch the women pass by. Some stared with open curiosity, others with expressions Greta could not quite interpret, mixtures of confusion and concern and something that might have been sympathy. But none of them called out crude suggestions or made the graphic gestures she had learned to expect when groups of soldiers noticed women walking past. They simply observed and then returned their attention to their card games and letter writing and quiet conversations. Building 7 turned out to be a converted barracks with 6 narrow cots arranged in 2 rows along opposite walls, each bed made up with a folded blanket and accompanied by a small wooden crate positioned to serve as a bedside table. The blankets were wool, thick and substantial, with the kind of softness that indicated they had been properly washed and dried rather than simply reused without cleaning. Greta ran her fingertips along the edge of one blanket and felt something loosen painfully in her chest at the simple luxury of clean fabric that did not smell of previous occupants. "There are rules here that you need to understand," Morrison said, pulling a folded sheet of paper from inside his uniform jacket. He walked to the wall beside the door and used a small tack to post the paper where it would be clearly visible to anyone in the room. The text had been written in German using careful black lettering that was easy to read even from a distance. "Rule number 1, he read aloud in case they could not see clearly. No prisoner or displaced person will be sexually assaulted or physically harmed while under American military protection. Rule number 2. No soldier may enter this building without receiving explicit permission from the occupants currently residing here. Rule number 3. Meals will be delivered at 0800 hours, 1200 hours, and 1800 hours daily. You are not required to earn these meals or provide anything in exchange for them. They are provided as a basic human right. Ingrid stared at the posted rules with an intensity that suggested she was trying to decode a foreign language or solve a complex mathematical problem. "This is," she started to say, then stopped abruptly, as if the words she needed to complete the thought did not exist in any language she knew how to speak. A young guard appeared in the doorway carrying a large metal pot and 3 bowls balanced carefully in his other arm. He looked barely older than Liesl, with the soft features and slight awkwardness of someone who had probably been working on his family's farm 12 months earlier before being drafted into military service. He set the pot down on the floor just inside the doorframe and stepped back immediately, creating distance without being asked. "Soup," he said in badly broken German, his cheeks flushing pink with the effort of communicating in an unfamiliar language. "Is hot soup for eating now?" When he reached forward slightly to hand one of the bowls directly to Liesl, clearly trying to be helpful, she flinched with such violence that she stumbled backward over her own feet and fell onto one of the cots behind her. The young guard froze instantly, his face going pale with horror at having frightened her without intending to. Morrison appeared beside him within seconds, his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Johnson," he said quietly in English, then switched back to German for the women's benefit. "We must always announce ourselves clearly. We maintain respectful distance at all times. We allow them to come to us when they are ready, rather than approaching them uninvited." The guard called Johnson nodded rapidly, understanding flooding his features as he realized his mistake. He carefully set all 3 bowls on the floor beside the pot of soup, arranging them in a neat row. "I am sorry," he whispered in halting German, his voice thick with genuine regret. "Very, very sorry. No hurt. I promise no hurt." After both men had left and closed the door behind them, the 3 women sat in complete silence for several minutes, simply staring at the steaming pot of soup positioned on their floor. It smelled rich and nourishing, carrying the aroma of actual vegetables and what might have been real meat, ingredients they had not encountered in months. But more significant than the quality of the food itself was the fact that it had been given to them freely, delivered without demands or expectations, offered without requiring payment of any kind. Greta reached for one of the bowls with fingers that trembled visibly, half expecting someone to suddenly appear and name the price she would be required to pay for this apparent kindness. But no one came. No one demanded anything. Outside their window, as darkness began to fall, she could hear American soldiers calling to each other in the gathering dusk, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie and casual banter of men who expected to sleep safely through the night without fear of bombardment or attack. For the first time in 4 years, Greta allowed herself to wonder whether she might also sleep safely tonight, whether morning might arrive without bringing fresh trauma or new reasons to wish she had died instead of surviving. The routine that developed over the following days began to feel almost miraculous in its consistency and predictability. Breakfast arrived at precisely 8 o'clock each morning, delivered by the young soldier Johnson, who had learned with remarkable speed to knock twice on the door, announce his presence clearly in his improving German, and then wait patiently for verbal permission before entering their space. He set each meal tray just inside the doorway with a kind of careful reverence, as if he understood on some intuitive level that he was handling something far more fragile than simple dishes and food. Greta found herself waking several minutes before the knock each morning, her nervous system still programmed for constant vigilance and immediate threat assessment, but no longer braced for the immediate danger that had characterized her previous 4 years. She would lie quietly on her cot in those early morning minutes, listening to Liesl's soft breathing and Ingrid's precisely controlled sleep patterns, marvelling at the absence of heavy boots stomping through hallways, the lack of crude voices demanding entrance, the simple quiet that felt almost too good to trust or believe in. The infection in her right shoulder had been festering for several weeks now, a painful souvenir from a particularly brutal Wehrmacht officer who had derived obvious pleasure from leaving visible marks on the women's bodies. She had hidden the injury well, Knowing from extensive experience that visible wounds tended to make men react in one of two ways, either becoming more violent in their treatment or more disgusted by her damaged appearance, neither of which led to better outcomes. But on the fourth morning after their arrival at Camp Lucky Strike, when she could not lift her right arm above shoulder height without wincing visibly from the pain, Liesl noticed the way she was favouring her left side and compensating for the weakness in her right shoulder. "You have an injury," Liesl said with the particular gentleness she reserved for moments when she was not completely overwhelmed by her own terror and trauma. "The right shoulder, yes? Something is wrong there." Before Greta could deflect the concern or minimise the problem as she had been doing for weeks, Ingrid was kneeling beside her cot with the efficient assessment skills of someone who had spent years caring for other people. "That needs proper medical attention immediately," she said with quiet authority, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. "The infection is spreading. I can see the inflammation from here." The idea of voluntarily asking for help from American soldiers felt fundamentally impossible to Greta. In her experience, help from men always came with a price attached, strings that became visible only after you had accepted the assistance and could no longer refuse the payment demanded. Medical attention from men especially had never been about healing or caring, but rather about keeping property functional enough to continue serving its purpose. But as the morning progressed and the throbbing pain in her shoulder intensified to the point where she felt slightly nauseous from the constant discomfort, Greta found herself actually considering the previously unthinkable option of requesting medical care. When Johnson arrived with their lunch delivery, Ingrid stepped forward with the careful dignity that somehow made her seem taller than her actual modest height. "Excuse me, please," she said in her most precise German, then attempted the English phrase she had been quietly practicing that morning. "Medical help needed, please." Johnson's boyish face immediately creased with obvious concern and worry. He set down the food tray with hasty movements and hurried away without another word, returning within minutes accompanied by a compact Asian-American soldier who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone thoroughly accustomed to handling medical emergencies. "I am Corporal Chen," the medic said in German that was significantly better than Morrison's, his accent barely noticeable. "I understand that someone here requires medical attention. May I ask who is injured?" When Greta reluctantly indicated her injured shoulder with a small gesture, Chen nodded calmly and began opening his medical bag on the small wooden table, but instead of immediately reaching for her or demanding she remove her clothing, he started pulling out supplies one by one and explaining each item in detail as he set it down in an organized row. "This is antiseptic solution for cleaning wounds," he said, showing her a brown glass bottle and allowing her to see the label. "These are clean bandages, sterilized and individually wrapped. This is antibiotic powder that helps prevent bacterial infections from spreading further. When I clean the wound properly, the antiseptic will probably sting quite a bit, but the temporary discomfort will help prevent more serious infection from developing." He paused in his preparations and looked directly at Greta with clear, honest eyes. "I need to examine the injury carefully in order to treat it properly and determine the best course of action," he said slowly. "Is that acceptable to you? May I have your permission to examine your shoulder?" The question seemed to hang suspended in the air like something unprecedented in Greta's experience. "Acceptable to you. May I have your permission?" As if her acceptance actually mattered, as if she possessed the genuine right to refuse a man who wanted to touch her body, as if her consent was a real thing that carried actual weight rather than a polite fiction. "Yes," she whispered, then cleared her throat and forced herself to say it again more firmly, practicing what it felt like to give permission that might actually mean something. "Yes, you may examine it." Chen's medical examination was thoroughly clinical and remarkably gentle, his hands moving with careful precision and his voice remaining steady and informative as he explained what he was discovering. "The infection is localized to the immediate area around the wound, but it has become quite significant," he said as he worked, cleaning the damaged tissue with methodical care. I will need to clean it very thoroughly and apply antibiotics generously. You should keep the area dry and covered for several days while it heals. Change the dressing daily with clean hands and watch carefully for any signs that the infection is spreading rather than improving. As he worked with focused concentration, Greta found herself studying his face intently, searching for the familiar signs she had learned to read in men's expressions. But there was no hunger visible in his features, no calculation about what this medical attention might entitle him to later, no sense that he was performing a service that would require repayment in some form. He simply tended to her injury with the same focused professional care she imagined he would provide to any wounded soldier under his responsibility. "There we are," he said finally, securing the clean white bandage with medical tape, his fingers gentle as they pressed the edges into place. "Make sure to change this dressing every day without fail. If you notice any red streaks extending outward from the wound site, or if you develop a fever with chills, you must have someone find me immediately regardless of what time of day or night it occurs. Those symptoms would indicate the infection is spreading into your bloodstream and would require more aggressive treatment." He packed up his medical supplies with the same methodical efficiency he had displayed throughout the treatment and stood to leave, but made no immediate move toward the door, instead lingering for a moment as if considering whether to say something additional. The human body possesses truly remarkable healing capacity when it is given proper care and genuine safety, he said quietly, his tone suggesting he was talking about more than just physical wounds. Both of those things, proper care and genuine safety, are available to you here for as long as you need them. After he left and closed the door gently behind him, the three women sat together in stunned silence for several long minutes, processing what had just occurred. Finally, Liesl spoke up with something in her voice that might have been wonder or perhaps the first fragile stirrings of hope. "He asked your permission before touching you," she said slowly, as if testing whether the words would still be true when spoken aloud. "He actually asked if it was acceptable and waited for you to answer. And he explained everything in advance," Ingrid added, her teacher's mind automatically cataloguing the unprecedented experience for future reference. Every single step of the procedure, every supply he was using, every reason behind his actions. He treated you like an intelligent person capable of understanding medical information rather than like property that simply needed to be maintained. That evening, when Morrison made his routine check to ensure they had everything they needed, Ingrid surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping forward to address him directly. "The Red Cross organization," she said carefully, choosing her words with obvious thought. "Do they carry letters and messages? Can they help locate family members who have been separated?" Morrison's weathered face softened visibly with something that looked like compassionate understanding. "Yes, they absolutely do," he replied gently. "The Red Cross has been very effective at reuniting separated families, especially children who were displaced during the conflict. Do you have family members you would like to attempt to locate?" "My sons," Ingrid said, and speaking the words aloud seemed to unlock something that had been held tightly closed inside her chest for years, releasing emotions she had carefully suppressed for so long that she had almost convinced herself they no longer existed. "Twin boys. They would be 11 years old now if they are still alive. They were placed in American custody when I was—" She stopped abruptly, physically unable to finish the sentence that would require her to speak about how and why she had been separated from her children. "I will personally get you the necessary paperwork tomorrow morning," Morrison said with gentle firmness that suggested he understood exactly what she was not saying. "The Red Cross has been remarkably successful at reuniting families. There is genuine reason to hope you might find your sons." That night, for the first time since they had arrived at Camp Lucky Strike, the three women talked about something other than immediate survival and basic safety. Liesl mentioned hesitantly that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher like Ingrid, had imagined herself standing in front of a classroom full of children and helping them learn to read and write. Greta spoke haltingly about her mother's garden, describing in careful detail how the roses climbed the cottage walls each summer, filling the air with fragrance that attracted bees and butterflies. Ingrid described her twin son's laughter with such vivid detail that Greta could almost hear it, the way they had run to greet her each afternoon when she returned home from teaching, their small bodies colliding with her legs in enthusiastic embraces. Their voices gradually grew stronger as they spoke, slowly losing the perpetual whispered quality that had become such automatic second nature that they had almost forgotten how to speak at normal volume. Outside their window, the American camp settled into its comfortable evening routine, the familiar sounds of safety and normalcy drifting through the spring air like promises of a different kind of future. For the first time in years, tomorrow felt like something to actively anticipate rather than something to simply endure until it was over. The film reel arrived on a grey morning when the spring air carried more cold dampness than warmth, making Greta wish for thicker clothing than the thin dress she owned. She noticed the change in the camp's general atmosphere before she understood what was causing it, the way tension can be felt in the air before thunder announces itself. Conversation among soldiers stopped abruptly when they passed near Building 7, and the easy laughter that had become familiar background noise over the past week grew increasingly sparse and strained until it disappeared almost entirely. Morrison appeared at their door just after breakfast, his usually steady demeanour replaced by something heavier and more troubled. Behind him stood a soldier Greta had not seen before during their time at the camp, a compact man with hard eyes and shoulders that seemed to carry invisible weight, tension visible in every line of his body. "This is Corporal Sullivan," Morrison said in his careful German, his tone more formal than usual. "He will be working with our unit for the next several weeks as we process displaced persons and prepare for repatriation." Sullivan's gaze swept over the three women with an expression Greta recognized immediately from years of reading men's faces for microscopic signs of danger or contempt. It was not the clinical professional assessment she had received from the medic Chen, or the gentle concern that characterized young Johnson's expressions. This was evaluation and judgment, the look of someone actively trying to determine guilt or innocence, complicity or victimhood. "Ma'am?" Sullivan said stiffly, nodding in Ingrid's direction as the eldest woman present, but his voice carried an undertone that made Liesel unconsciously move closer to Greta's protective presence. After they left and closed the door, an uncomfortable silence settled over Building 7 like a physical presence in the room. The easy routine they had begun to trust over the past days suddenly felt fragile and temporary, as if a single suspicious look from the wrong person could shatter whatever safety they had barely begun to accept as possibly real. The change in the camp's atmosphere became increasingly pronounced over the following days. Guards who had grown accustomed to casual, friendly conversation now maintained strict professional distance when delivering meals or passing by their building. Johnson still brought their food trays with careful courtesy at the designated times, but his boyish smile seemed forced and uncomfortable now, and he avoided making direct eye contact with any of them in a way that suggested someone had spoken to him about appropriate boundaries or proper protocols. It was Corporal Chen who finally explained what was causing the shift in how the American soldiers were treating them. He arrived to check the healing progress of Greta's shoulder wound with his usual medical bag, but even his typically calm professional demeanour seemed somewhat strained and troubled. "There has been new information revealed about the concentration camps," he said quietly as he carefully removed the old bandage and examined the improving wound site. "Film footage and extensive documentation. Photographs and survivor testimonies. The soldiers here are still processing what they have seen and trying to understand what happened." Greta felt her chest tighten painfully, making it difficult to draw a full breath. They had heard terrible whispers about the camps over the years, horrifying rumours that had seemed too monstrous to believe even though they came from multiple sources. But whispers and documented photographic reality were fundamentally different things, carried different weight, demanded different responses. "Some of the men are struggling very hard to understand the difference between victims and perpetrators," Chen continued as he applied fresh, clean bandages with gentle precision, It is extremely difficult for them to process the reality that German women could suffer terribly under the same system that committed such massive atrocities against others. The moral categories that seemed clear before are becoming much more complicated now that they are confronting actual human beings rather than abstract concepts. That afternoon, Sullivan appeared at their door again, but this time without Morrison's moderating diplomatic presence to soften his approach. He carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty that he nonetheless believed was necessary and important. "I need to ask you some questions," he said in heavily accented German, his tone suggesting that the questions were more like accusations waiting to be confirmed through interrogation. Ingrid straightened to her full height and assumed the authoritative posture that had once commanded respect in classrooms full of unruly students. "What kind of questions do you need to ask us?" Sullivan opened the manila folder and pulled out several photographs, grainy black and white images that made Liesel gasp audibly and turn her face away toward the wall. The images showed emaciated figures standing behind barbed wire fencing, mass graves filled with bodies stacked like cordwood, children with hollow eyes and protruding ribs staring at the camera with expressions beyond despair. "What did you know about this?" Sullivan asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger that threatened to break through his professional exterior at any moment. "What did you see? How could this be happening while you were living normal lives?" The photographs lay on the small table between them like evidence in a trial, like proof of guilt that demanded explanation and accounting. Greta stared at the documented proof of systematic industrial murder and felt something fundamental collapse inside her chest. Not surprise exactly, but a terrible confirmation of humanity's capacity for evil on scales that defied comprehension. She had known evil intimately, had lived with it pressed against her skin and inside her body for 4 years, had felt it destroy pieces of her soul that she would never recover. But seeing it documented officially, made real through photographs and witness statements, somehow made her own survival feel like a form of complicity she could never wash away. "We knew that we were nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the small room. "We knew that we did not matter, that our lives held no value to anyone. We knew what human beings were capable of because we experienced it every day." "That is not an answer to my question," Sullivan pressed, and now his anger was fully visible in his clenched jaw and rigid posture. These camps were located all over Germany, in cities and towns and rural areas. People had to know they existed. People had to see the smoke from the crematoria. People had to smell what was burning. How could you not know? Liesel began shaking uncontrollably, her fragile stability crumbling completely under the weight of Sullivan's accusation and the horrible images she had glimpsed before turning away. "They told us we were lucky," she said through tears that streamed down her young face. "They told us we could have been sent to the work camps instead if we did not cooperate. We thought they meant factory work, making uniforms or weapons. We did not know. We did not understand what the alternative actually meant. Ingrid's teacher instincts activated automatically even as her own carefully maintained composure threatened to disintegrate. We were told we were serving the Reich by providing comfort to soldiers fighting on the front lines," she said with bitter precision, each word carefully chosen. "We were told we were paying a price to protect other German women from being subjected to the same treatment. We were told our sacrifice had meaning and purpose in the larger scheme of the war effort." Sullivan stared at them with disgust that felt like a physical blow, his contempt visible in every line of his face. "How do we know you are not just as guilty as all the rest of them?" he asked in a voice that had already decided the answer. "How do we know you did not volunteer for this service willingly? How do we know you were not complicit in everything that happened?" The question hung in the air like a final verdict, judgment passed and sentence delivered. Greta felt the fragile structure of safety and dignity she had started to rebuild over the past week crumble completely around her, revealing the raw shame underneath that she had fought so desperately hard to contain and control. The terrible knowledge that while they had been trapped in their own specific hell, others had been suffering and dying in ways that made their own torture seem almost merciful, by comparison, was overwhelming. What right did she have to complain about her own mistreatment when millions had been systematically murdered? "Maybe we are guilty," Greta said finally, the words scraping her throat raw like broken glass. "Maybe surviving when so many others died makes us complicit. Maybe we should have found ways to die instead of accepting what was done to us. Maybe continuing to breathe is its own form of collaboration." Sullivan gathered up his photographs with quick, angry movements and stood abruptly, leaving them alone with their shame and the horrible certainty that their brief taste of being treated with dignity had been a cruel illusion that was now shattered beyond repair. They huddled together on the narrow cots as darkness fell outside their window. No longer 3 women healing from trauma, but 3 German women who carried the collective guilt of a nation that had committed crimes beyond comprehension, marked by their survival as surely as if accusations had been tattooed permanently on their foreheads. Outside their window, the American camp continued its normal evening routines, but now those familiar sounds felt distant and condemning, as if even the spring air itself carried judgment against them for the crime of being German and female and alive when millions of others were dead. The silence that filled Building 7 during the 3 days following Sullivan's interrogation had actual physical weight, pressing down on them like a heavy blanket that made even breathing feel difficult. The women moved through their established routines like ghosts haunting their own lives, accepting their delivered meals with downcast eyes and whispered thanks that barely qualified as audible, waiting with grim certainty for the inevitable moment when someone would finally realize the full truth about what they were and take away even these small temporary mercies they had been granted. Greta found herself mentally cataloguing every kindness she had received since arriving at Camp Lucky Strike, preparing herself emotionally to surrender each one as payment for the crime of surviving when others had not. The clean, soft blankets, the gentle, respectful medical care, the revolutionary concept of being asked for permission before men touched her body, all of it felt stolen now, luxuries she had no right to claim or enjoy while millions of innocent people had died in camps throughout Germany. Liesel had retreated completely into the manic silence that had once served as her primary defense mechanism during the worst periods at the brothel, rocking slightly back and forth on her cot and staring at the wall with eyes that did not see anything in the present moment. Ingrid sat rigid and watchful on her own cot, her teacher's mind working frantically and futilely to find some logical framework that could make sense of concepts like guilt and innocence in a world where both had become essentially meaningless. When Morrison appeared in their doorway on the 4th morning, flanked by Sullivan and carrying what looked like official documentation, Greta felt her heart sink toward her stomach with the weight of dread. This was the moment she had been anticipating with sick certainty, the inevitable reckoning, the official judgment that would strip away their temporary sanctuary and confirm what Sullivan's photographs had already proven beyond doubt, that German women who had survived the war were inherently suspect, automatically complicit by virtue of still breathing. But instead of reading formal charges or demanding detailed confessions, Morrison stepped forward into the room with the same careful gentleness he had demonstrated since their very first interaction. Sullivan stood behind him in the doorway, his face displaying a complicated mask of conflicted emotions that seemed to be actively warring with each other in real time, struggling towards some resolution. "What happened in those concentration camps?" Morrison said quietly, his weathered hand steady on the documents he carried. "That is not your fault or your responsibility. What happened to you in that military brothel, that is not your fault either. You did not create the system that victimized you and millions of others. You were trapped inside it, just like everyone else who suffered." The words seemed to originate from some impossible place where logic and genuine mercy could somehow coexist and reinforce each other. Greta felt them impact her chest like physical blows, each carefully chosen syllable challenging the guilt she had wrapped around herself like protective armor, the shame she had internalized so completely that it had become part of her fundamental identity. Morrison turned slightly to deliberately include Sullivan in his direct gaze. These women survived an unimaginable hell that most people cannot even begin to comprehend, he said with absolute conviction. They are not the enemy we have been fighting against. They are living evidence of exactly what we have been fighting against all along. They are proof of why this war needed to be fought and won. Sullivan's face seemed to crumble slightly, as if some internal dam had finally given way and released pressure that had been building for weeks or months. He looked directly at Greta with eyes that appeared to actually see her clearly for perhaps the first time since they had met, not as a representative of German guilt or collective responsibility, but as a 23-year-old woman whose childhood had been violently stolen and whose innocence had been systematically weaponized against her by men who should have protected her. "How old were you?" he asked in halting, uncertain German, his voice completely stripped of the accusation and contempt that had characterized their previous interactions. "When they first took you away from your family. How many years did you have?" 19 years old, Greta whispered, the number feeling simultaneously ancient and impossibly young, a lifetime ago, and also just yesterday. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly, as if processing information that caused him physical pain, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted in his entire demeanour and approach. "Jesus Christ," he breathed in English, then struggled visibly to find the correct German words to express what he was thinking and feeling. "My little sister back home in Ohio, she just turned 19 years old last month. I cannot imagine. I cannot conceive of anyone doing to her what was done to you." He extended his hand toward Greta, not to take anything from her or demand anything of her, but to offer physical support and assistance as she stood up from the cot. The gesture was small and simple, but it carried monumental significance as the first time in 4 long years that a man had reached for her with the clear intention of lifting her up rather than pulling her down, of supporting rather than exploiting. "I am deeply sorry," Sullivan said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words as emotion threatened to overwhelm his attempt at controlled speech. "My older brother Michael died fighting against this system in France 2 years ago. I mistakenly thought that anger and blame would somehow honour his sacrifice and his memory. But he would be ashamed of me right now if he could see how I have been treating you. He would want me to help you recover and heal, not to hurt you more than you have already been hurt." Morrison opened the official documents he had been holding, and Greta could see they were not formal charges or condemnations, but rather Red Cross paperwork and repatriation forms with spaces for names and identifying information. "We have successfully located Ingrid's twin sons through Red Cross Family Tracing Services," he said gently, his voice carrying genuine warmth and pleasure at delivering good news. "They are safe and healthy in American custody in Munich, living in a children's facility there. They have been asking about their mother every single day since they were separated from her. They remember her and they want to see her again." Ingrid's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely and irrevocably. She wept not from pain or accumulated trauma or overwhelming shame, but from the foreign and almost forgotten sensation of hope actually fulfilled, of maternal love that was rewarded rather than punished, of believing that something good could actually happen after years of expecting only cruelty and loss. Liesel reached for Ingrid with hands that shook visibly, and for the first time in days, her young face showed something other than blank terror or dissociative numbness. A small, fragile smile appeared on her features like the first flower pushing through frozen ground at the end of a long winter. "You will all be transferred to the repatriation centre in Munich next week to begin the process of rebuilding your lives," Morrison continued with steady kindness. "But I want you to understand something very clearly before you leave this camp and go back out into the larger world." He looked at each of them in turn, his expression carrying the weight of absolute conviction and unshakable certainty. "When you tell people your stories about what you experienced, make sure you also tell them what you saw here at Camp Lucky Strike. Tell them that some American soldiers remembered you were human beings, deserving of dignity and respect, even when the rest of the world had forgotten that fundamental truth. Tell them that mercy and kindness are possible, even in the aftermath of the worst evil. Greta felt something shift and resettle inside her chest, not the violent cracking of something breaking apart, but rather the careful settling of broken pieces, finally finding their proper places and beginning the long, slow process of knitting back together. She had been 19 years old when unknown men had stolen her life and destroyed her innocence, but she was 23 now, and 23 was old enough to make conscious, deliberate choices about what to do with whatever life remained ahead of her, however damaged and imperfect that life might be. "Tell your families and friends," Greta said, her voice growing stronger and more certain with each word she spoke, "that 3 German women who were victimized by evil men will spend the rest of their lives working to prove that mercy is ultimately stronger than cruelty, that kindness can survive even in the aftermath of the worst imaginable brutality, that human decency can persist even after everything good seems to have been destroyed." Outside their window, the spring afternoon carried the sounds of men preparing for peace rather than continuing to wage war, voices calling to each other about home and family and the future that was finally becoming visible now that the fighting was ending. And for the first time since their liberation, the concept of future felt like something genuinely worth walking toward with intention and hope, rather than simply something to endure passively until death finally arrived to end the suffering. The war was ending, and perhaps, just perhaps, they might be allowed to survive long enough to see what came after the war, to discover whether healing was actually possible or whether some wounds were simply too deep to ever fully close.